The last night, this is the page 29. Utterson's called by Poole, who's the butler, and Poole says this on the sort of five lines down on 29. "It seems much changed," replied the lawyer, very pale, but giving look for look. "Changed? Well, yes, I think so. I've been 20 years in this man's house. To be deceived by his voice? No, sir. Master's made away with. He was made away with 8 days ago, when we heard him cry out upon the name of God. And who's in there instead of him? And why it stays there is such a thing that cries to heaven, Mr. Utterson." So, we've learnt that there's this person inside the house, in the respectable Dr. Jekyll's house. Obviously, we suspect it's Hyde. On the very bottom of 28, a voice answered within. "Tell him I cannot see anyone," it said complainingly. And this voice, presumably, is the voice that is not convincing as Dr. Jekyll, but is, of course, Mr. Hyde. So more suspense is built up by the fact that Hyde is now in the residence of Jekyll, and Jekyll seems to have gone. Page 30. "Seen him?" repeated Mr. Utterson. "Well," this is about 7 lines down. "That's it! It was his way. I suddenly came suddenly into the theatre from the garden. It seems he had slipped out to look for this drug, or whatever it was, for the cabinet door was open, and there he was at the far end of the room, digging among the crates. He looked up when I came in, gave a kind of cry, and whipped upstairs into the cabinet. It was but for 1 minute that I saw him, but my hair stood upon my head like quills." So like a quill pen, like feathers. You know, his hair he's totally terrified by the sight of this person. "Sir, if that was my master, why had he a mask upon his face? If it was my master, why did he cry out like a rat and run from me? I've served him long enough." And then the man paused and passed his hand over his face. "These are very strange circumstances," said Mr. Utterson, "but I begin to see daylight. Your master, Poole, is plainly seized with one of those maladies that both torture and deform the sufferer. Hence, for aught I know, the alteration of his voice. Hence the mask and avoidance of friends. Hence his eagerness to find this drug, by means of which the poor soul retains some hope of ultimate recovery. God grant that he be not deceived. There is my explanation. It is sad enough, Poole, aye, and appalling to consider, and it is plain and natural, hangs well together, and delivers us from all exorbitant alarms." So Utterson, forever trying to find the solution, thinks that Jekyll is diseased and is wearing a mask. But the butler says, "Sir," said the butler, turning to a sort of mottled pallor, "that thing was not my master, and there's the truth. My master," here he looked round him and began to whisper, "is a tall, fine build of a man, and this was more like a dwarf." So we now really realise that it must have been Hyde who was there. Page 31, about 2/3 of the way down the page. "Quite so," returned Poole. "Well, when that masked thing like a monkey jumped from the chemicals and whipped into the cabinet, it went down my spine like ice. Oh, I know it's not evidence, Mr. Utterson. I'm book learned enough for that. But a man has his feelings, and I give you my Bible word, it was Mr. Hyde." So they're convinced that Hyde is in the laboratory of Jekyll, building up suspense as the two of them talk to each other. And notice how Stevenson builds suspense through the use of dialogue, doesn't he? Where the butler, who knows Jekyll very well, discusses with the best friend of Jekyll what's going on. Then on bottom of page 32, we have the ratcheting up of suspense again, as Utterson knocks on the door of the laboratory and then breaks into it. Let's read this section from the sort of bottom section of page 32 of the Wordsworth edition. "Jekyll," cried Utterson with a loud voice, "I demand to see you." He paused a moment, and came no reply. "I give you fair warning. Our suspicions are aroused, and I must and shall see you," he resumed. "If not by fair means, then by foul. If not of your consent, then by brute force." "Utterson," said the voice, "for God's sake have mercy." "Ah, that is not Jekyll's voice." "It's Hyde's," cried Utterson. "Down with the door, Poole." Poole swung the axe over his shoulder. The blow shook the building, and the red baize door leapt against the lock and hinges. A dismal screech, as of a mere animal terror, rang from the cabinet. Up went the axe again and again, and the panels crashed and the frame bounded. 4 times the blow fell, but the wood was tough and the fittings were of excellent workmanship, and it was not until the 5th that the lock burst in asunder and the wreck of the door fell inwards on the carpet. So we have this image of the door being broken down. Remember, there's a lot of imagery to do with doors in this book. You need to think about, well, what do the doors symbolise? Do they symbolise the covering up of secrets, the sealing off of sinful things, the imprisoning of Satan? What do they symbolise for you? And finally, in this last climactic section of the kind of third-person narrative that we have, that's the beginning of this book, the door is hacked down. And then they go into the laboratory and they find in the 3rd paragraph of page 33, let's read this, "Right in the midst lay the body of a man, sorely contorted and twitching. They drew near on tiptoe, turned on its back, and beheld the face of Edward Hyde. He was dressed in clothes far too large for him, clothes of the doctor's bigness. The cords of his face moved with a semblance of life, but the life was gone, and by the crushed phial in the hand and strong smell of kernels that hung upon the air, Utterson knew that he was looking on the body of a self-destroyer." So Utterson believes he's looking at Hyde, who's killed himself, and by drinking chemicals, a crushed phial, a bottle full of chemicals, and it's crushed. He's smashed in from clutching it too tightly. And then we see the cords of his face. That's a rather interesting description. He's when you're sort of in the midst of a seizure, your face perhaps turns to cords, or kind of like rope almost. But as you are caught in this kind of terrible seizure, spasm or fit. And this is what's happening here. And then we have the added mystery of him being in these clothes that are far too big for him, the clothes of Jekyll. It's worth looking at these 2 pages, page 32 and 33, and coming up with your own ideas as to, how does Stevenson build suspense here? Think about his use of language, the descriptions. He uses quite a bit of onomatopoeia or sound words. He uses descriptions of how people look. Edward Hyde looks. And, of course, it's full of dramatic action, isn't it? The door being knocked down, the discovery of this dead body. It's full of... it's almost cinematic, isn't it? It's like watching a kind of a climax to a film. And it's no wonder why this book has been made into so many films. But the mystery continues, because on page 33, about 4 lines from bottom, 5 lines from bottom, nowhere was there any trace of Henry Jekyll, dead or alive. And then we go to page 35, as the hunt goes on for him. And here, I'll just read this section. "He caught the next paper. It was a brief note in the doctor's hand, and dated at the top. 'Oh, Poole!' the lawyer cried, He was alive and here this day. He cannot have been disposed of in so short a space. He must still be alive. He must have fled. And then why fled, and how? In that case, can we venture to declare a suicide? Oh, we must be careful. I foresee that we may yet involve your master in some dire catastrophe. So the mystery continues, because they find a letter written by Jekyll that was clearly indicates that he was there that day. And let's read this letter on page 35. My dear Utterson, when this shall fall into your hands, I shall have disappeared. Under what circumstances I have not the penetration to foresee, but my instincts and all the circumstances of my nameless situation tell me that the end is sure and must be early. Go then and read the first narrative which Lanyon warned me he was to place in your hands, and if you hear more, turn to the confession of your unworthy and unhappy friend, Henry Jekyll. So now, finally, we're being told that there are going to be some answers supplied. And notice how Jekyll is still in control here in a certain way, because he's saying, you know, how Utterson should discover things, telling him to look at Lanyon's narrative than his own. Right, you need to get some good notes on this chapter. It could well come up in the actual exam, I suspect. Some section of it, because it's full of moments when the tension and suspense builds and builds and builds and builds, and they break the door down, they break into the laboratory, and finally they find this horrible Edward Hyde dead, but in two big clothes, and the mystery just continues. And then we have the last bit, where we're promised some answers in the following few pages.